Welcome back to the HOA Saga. In Part 4, Margaret's empire starts to crack. The neighborhood is finally standing up, and the first sparks of rebellion are turning into a wildfire. If you haven't seen Parts 1 to 3 yet, click the links above to catch up. You need the full story to see just how Margaret's control began to crumble. Power is fragile, especially when it rests on fear. Margaret had ruled the neighborhood for over a decade with an iron clipboard, issuing fines, observing yards, and intimidating residents. But the very foundation of her authority, the silence, the isolation, the unquestioned obedience, was eroding. The subtle alliances, the shared grievances, and the small acts of rebellion I had orchestrated were about to expose cracks in her empire that she could no longer conceal. The first signs were almost imperceptible. Mrs. Turner refused to remove her rose bushes despite receiving a fine. John parked his truck overnight in defiance of long-standing rules. Little by little, neighbors began ignoring minor violations, no longer shrinking under the weight of Margaret's intimidation. Each small act of defiance was amplified by the collective courage spreading silently through the streets. Margaret's response was predictable, panic disguised as authority. She increased her patrols, scrutinized every property, and issued fines at an accelerated pace. Her behavior, however, betrayed anxiety. The more she pushed, the more the community's defiance strengthened. Where fear had once isolated, visibility of rebellion now encouraged solidarity. The HOA board, long silent under Margaret's rule, began to show cracks as well. Members who had once nodded obediently in her presence now questioned minor infractions, raised procedural concerns, and noticed inconsistencies in her enforcement. Margaret attempted to regain control, but the dominoes had already begun to fall. Her authority was no longer a given. It had to be earned, and every attempt to assert only highlighted her vulnerability. The pivotal moment came at the next HOA board meeting. Historically, these meetings were quiet affairs, sparsely attended and dominated by Margaret's commands. This time, however, the room was packed. Neighbors who had once whispered complaints now spoke openly, their voices resonating with collective frustration. Margaret attempted to assert order with her usual gavel and clipped instructions, but the energy in the room was fundamentally different. Questions came rapidly, directly, and relentlessly. Why had elections been postponed for years? Where were the financial statements for the HOA? Why were some residents fined for trivialities while she ignored her own violations? Margaret fumbled through her responses, excuses thin, her composure fraying. Every demand for accountability chipped away at the illusion of absolute power she had cultivated for years. Meanwhile, I watched quietly from back, the dossier of evidence safely in my possession. I did not need to speak yet. The community had found its voice. With each pointed question, each recounting of unfair fines, Margaret's authority weakened. Her empire, built on fear, secrecy, and selective enforcement, was beginning to crumble before my eyes. The subtle psychological shift was palpable. Neighbors no longer recoiled from her gaze. They held themselves upright, spoke confidently, and shared their stories openly. Fear had been replaced by awareness and solidarity. Margaret's presence, once imposing, now seemed desperate, almost absurd. Her attempts to assert dominance backfired, highlighting the inconsistency and hypocrisy we had documented. Every day, outside of meetings, the cracks widened. Decorative items that had been forbidden appeared on lawns. Lawns exceeded arbitrary height rules. Vehicles remained parked in previously prohibited spots. The rebellion was visible, undeniable, and growing. Margaret's obsession with minor infractions was no longer controlling behavior. It was evidence of her loss of power. At the same time, my network of allies expanded. Neighbors shared documentation, compared fines, and built an organized understanding of Margaret's selective enforcement and personal violations. The psychological groundwork was complete. The neighborhood recognized the imbalance of power, understood their collective strength, and saw the opportunity to reclaim authority. Yet Margaret remained unaware of the full extent of the preparation against her. The tax discrepancy, the misuse of HOA funds, and the video evidence of trespassing were still hidden in my dossier, waiting for a precise moment to deliver the final blow. Timing was critical. Exposing these truths prematurely could allow her to deflect or regroup. But the foundation of her power, the unquestioned obedience and fear, was now irreparably fractured. By the end of this stage, the signs were clear. Margaret's empire was no longer whole. Each small act of defiance, each challenge from the board or residents, was a wedge splitting the facade of her authority. The once imposing figure, feared by the neighborhood, was now visibly anxious, defensive, and increasingly isolated. The next chapter would bring the climax, the public exposure of her hypocrisy, mismanagement, and harassment. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and the neighborhood, united and emboldened, would witness the fall of a ruler who had long believed herself untouchable. Don't miss Part 5, where Margaret faces public exposure. Subscribe and hit the bell to follow every shocking moment of this HOA drama.